As long as she was moving her legs or something, they thought she was okay. But obviously she wasn't.
Tonight, the loss of a young woman's life prompts leaders in BC to call for an investigation into the police.
Are you going to smudge or not smudge? And if you want to smudge, you're going to find a source.
Traditional medicines, do they have a place in the retail market?
We will make it mandatory to consider Indigenous traditional knowledge alongside science and other evidence.
And the federal government suggests a substantial overhaul to environmental reviews. Good evening, I'm Brittany Hobson. The defense and Crown for the Gerald Stanley trial in Battleford, Saskatchewan have made their closing arguments. Stanley is charged with the second-degree murder of 22-year-old Colton Bushy. As APTN's Chris Stewart reports, it will now be up to the jury to decide if Stanley is guilty or not.
Thursday opened with defense lawyer Scott Spencer. He told the jury the 5 youth were up to no good when they came onto Stanley's farm. Spencer said the entire incident happened in 2 minutes and asked the jury to put themselves in Stanley's shoes. He sees his son nearly hit with a car. He then believes his wife might have been hit by their car. Spencer said Stanley was on a roller coaster of emotions and his adrenaline was high. Spencer told the jury the incident was tragic but not criminal, and that Stanley incorrectly thought there were 2 bullets in the gun. There were 3. He said Stanley had ejected the magazine and that it was a freak accident that the gun went off when Stanley attempted to turn their car's ignition off. Prosecution counsel Bill Burrs then addressed the jury. He admitted the group engaged in wrongdoing that day, but he told the jury that Stanley intentionally pulled the trigger and it was murder. Burge said Gerald Stanley walked to the group's car with a gun and knew a confrontation was likely. Stanley was using a firearm carelessly. The prosecution told the jury that while the defense said the gun was 60 years old and misfired, the gun could not fire if it was more than 2 millimeters out of battery, and Stanley's account of the incident can't be true. Burge then says a conviction of manslaughter is possible. Judge Popiscal read the charges to the jury and gave them their instructions. They are now deliberating the fate of Gerald Stanley. Outside the courthouse, supporters of Colton Bushy's family held a moment of silence.
There's a young man that is gone and is never coming back. And we need to be here to show his family that they're not alone in wanting justice, that we're with them. So please join me in a moment of quiet prayer.
The jury's deliberations continue. They must find him guilty of second-degree murder or manslaughter, or acquit him entirely. Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Battleford, Saskatchewan.
The 9th day in the trial for the murder of Tina Fontaine continued today in Winnipeg, and court heard from a former friend of Raymond Cormier's who testified she saw him being inappropriate with the teen. The Crown also presented a videotaped interview of Cormier. Holly Moore reports.
This interrogation video taken by the Winnipeg police shortly after his arrest in October 2014 shows an exhausted Cormier refusing to cooperate. Arresting officer Wade McDonald was in court today, and the court was reminded that Cormier did not have to say anything at all. He had the right to remain silent. And this afternoon, Sarah Holland, an associate of Cormier's who was one of the last people to see Tina Fontaine alive. She describes a violent fight right outside of her house, where Tina is threatening to call police. She said she only heard Raymond Cormier utter one word, river. Sarah Holland testified that she found out about Tina Fontaine's murder by looking at the front page of the paper. She went home and confronted Frenchie, which was a known alias of Raymond Cormier's. She asked him, "Did you do it?" And he said no. I'm Holly Moore with APTN National News, Winnipeg.
First Nations leaders in Northern Ontario are expressing shock after the deaths of 2 Fort Albany residents in Timmins who had interactions with police. Ontario's Special Investigation Unit is looking into the deaths of a 22-year-old man and a 62-year-old woman over the weekend. Dennis Ward has the story.
Ontario's Special Investigations Unit continues to look into a fatal police-involved shooting and the death of a woman. Early Saturday morning, Timmins police shot a 21-year-old who had been living in Timmins to access medical services not available in Fort Albany. Later that afternoon, a 62-year-old woman was allegedly causing a disturbance at a local shelter and transported to the police station where she was put in a cell. She was later rushed to the hospital, where she was pronounced dead the next day. A joint statement from Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler, Grand Chief Jonathan Solomon, and Fort Albany Chief Andrew Solomon says, quote, "We are shocked that 2 Fort Albany members have died at the hands of police. We are very troubled by these tragedies, and our thoughts and prayers are with the families in Fort Albany community. We do not yet know all the facts around these altercations, but encourage the Special Investigations Unit and the Chief Coroner of Ontario to get to the bottom of these incidents without delay." Timmins Mayor Steve Black spoke to the issue at this week's council meeting.
I would encourage our community to please refrain from some of the comments that are being made that directed towards the individual and the family that are not appropriate and racist in some regard in social media circles and definitely inappropriate for a time like this.
The chief of Fort Albany is calling for an investigation into the actions of the Timmins Police Service. Dennis Ward, APTN National News.
British Columbia's police watchdog has cleared the Port Alberni RCMP of any wrongdoing in the death of an 18-year-old woman. Jocelyn George died in 2016 after a night in police custody. Now, First Nation members are calling for a review of police conduct towards Indigenous people in the province. Lori Hamlin has the story.
Jocelyn George was 18 years old when she was taken into police custody in June 2016. The single mother of 2 died later that night in police cells.
Everybody was horrified. Like, how did this happen? Why did it happen? Why wasn't it caught sooner?
On June 23rd, George was brought into custody for being intoxicated in a public space. She was released that afternoon, but taken back into custody later that evening after a relative concerned for her well-being called police.
She had been in cells overnight at the RCMP station in Port Alberni, and they didn't notice that her health had been deteriorating. And when they checked her in the morning, obviously something was wrong, and by the time they got her to the hospital and they flew her to Victoria, it was too late.
The report from the RCMP's watchdog, the Independent Investigation Office, states that George died from the impacts of methamphetamine and cocaine on her heart. It also states that while in custody, a senior officer did not make personal visits to George. Judith Sayers, the president of the Nuchalak Tribal Council, says George was mostly monitored through a camera.
She was moving around, she sat up, apparently got up and leaned against the wall, and as long as she was moving her legs or something, they thought she was okay, but obviously she wasn't.
The RCMP were cleared of any wrongdoing. Jocelyn George's family say they are shocked and disappointed that the RCMP have been cleared of all responsibility.
It was in the report that why didn't the guard check on her? The security guard should always check on the people, especially when they're incarcerated for intoxication of alcohol or drugs.
The head of the Nuchalak Tribal Council says she wants a full review of RCMP procedures.
We've had other Nuchalak die in custody before. We don't want to see it ever happen again. And if we can take measures, if we can learn from this experience so that others don't die in custody, we'll feel so much better that we've done everything that we can to help, the memory of Jocelyn.
Lori Hamlin, APTN National News, Vancouver.
Coming up after the break, the federal government announced it's looking to overhaul Canada's environmental assessment process. But before that, here's a preview of tonight's episode of Nation to Nation.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran. Here's what's coming up on Nation to Nation. Last night, Romeo Saganash's private member's bill asking the government to adopt UNDRIP passed second reading. Only the Conservative Party voted against it. On tonight's political panel, the Conservative Indigenous Affairs Shadow Minister, Cathy McLeod, explains why. The bill still has other parliamentary hoops to jump through before becoming law. I'll talk to a Bill C-262 advocate who is confident it will before the current government's mandate is up next year. That's right after the national news.
Here's a look at Friday's weather forecast starting on the East Coast. 0 in St. John's, +2 with snow in Charlottetown, sunny and -13 in Happy Valley, Goose Bay, -18 in La Grande. -4 in Quebec, -11 in Chibougamau and Val-d'Or, a snowy -4 in Peterborough, -11 in Sault Ste. Marie, 10 below in Sudbury, sunny and -10 in Timmins. In northern Manitoba, -23 in Churchill, -11 in Flin Flon, -12 in Gimli Harbor and Winnipeg. Sunny skies in parts of Saskatchewan, -11 in Estevan, -10 in North Battleford, -9 in Meadow Lake, -21 in Stony Rapids. Welcome back. The long road of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples took another turn in Parliament. Bill C-262 has passed second reading in the House of Commons and now goes to committee. Act to ensure the laws of Canada are in harmony with Indigenous rights. It's a private member's bill from NDP MP Romeo Saganash. The bill passed with a vote of 217 yeas and 76 nays. Now, federal parties will work on the principles of the bill and debate what that will mean for Canadian law.
Accordingly, the bill stands referred to the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
It's out with the old and in with the new. The Liberal government is proposing an overhaul of this country's environmental and regulatory reviews. Here's Annette Francis with a glimpse of the new rules.
First, an acknowledgement of the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. Then the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Catherine McKenna, quickly carried on with the Liberals' newly proposed environmental legislation to a room full of reporters.
The legislation we are introducing today aims to restore public trust in how the federal government makes decisions about major projects like mines, pipelines, and hydro dams. These better rules are designed to protect our environment while improving investor confidence, strengthening our economy, and creating good middle-class jobs.
According to Minister McKenna, the bill would change the way environmental assessments are done and include more input from Canadians and Indigenous peoples. It would also mean a speedier timeline, and the assessment of major projects would have to be complete within 2 years.
We will make it mandatory to consider Indigenous traditional knowledge alongside science and other evidence. Indigenous jurisdictions will have greater opportunities to exercise powers and duties under the new Impact Assessment Act. And we will increase the funding available to support Indigenous participation in capacity development related to assessing and monitoring the impacts of projects.
The proposed legislation would also include changes to the Navigable Waters Act, which would mean expanded protection on waterways, including lakes and rivers. Elizabeth May, the leader of the Green Party, says much of it is a big disappointment, but she supports some of the changes.
This one keeps the schedule of rivers and lakes that Harper created, allows for people to petition to have a specific river or lake that they like added, but also expands the definition of navigable waters. So this is better than what I was expecting. Thank you, Mark Garneau. Better than what I was expecting. Navigable waters now include waters that people are using, even if they're not on the schedule, as I understand it.
Minister McKenna says the new rules could mean an earlier engagement with Indigenous peoples from the start. But the federal government will make a determination on the national interest. Annette Francis, APTN National News, Ottawa.
The David Suzuki Foundation released its second annual report on the federal government's progress on ending all long-term drinking water advisories in First Nations. For more on the report, I'm joined by Alea Boisvert, spokesperson for the David Suzuki Foundation. Thanks for joining us, Alea. What are the key points coming out of this year's report?
Well, what we've discovered through this year's report is that while the Minister of Indigenous Services has made several very important public announcements regarding the intent of the government to end long-term drinking water advisories by 2021, that in fact there's still more work that needs to be done and challenges within the federal bureaucracy of actually fulfilling that commitment within the time frame and the budget that they've allocated.
The report underlines 3 urgent areas that need to be addressed by the federal government. What are they?
So what we've discovered that we need to see is that there needs to be further investment in and sharing of successful models where First Nations have been leading within their communities to find solutions to ending the drinking water crisis. And this includes investing in the development and implementation of source water protection plans that are consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So this is really important as far as ensuring that First Nations have say over what happens in their traditional territories on reserve with respect to the protection of their waters. The second point is that we know that we need to ensure that there are expedited but sound processes to upgrade systems, with 91 long-term drinking water advisories that were announced in January, and now actually 92 as of just a couple days ago. We know that the funding of these systems has to happen quickly and thoroughly, and also that there needs to be adequate funding for operations and maintenance to ensure the sustainable solutions to the drinking water crisis in First Nations. And lastly, just that we know the government needs to develop legislation and regulations with respect to drinking water in First Nations, with First Nations as partners. And we were really happy to see that the Assembly of First Nations has been tasked with consulting and facilitating conversations about redesigning the process for dialogue around federal legislation that will ensure the federal government is held accountable to ensuring clean drinking water in communities.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us today, Alea, and giving us those insights.
Thank you so much for having me.
Earlier this week, we met an Alberta elder who was furious a Winners store in Calgary was selling sweetgrass. She said traditional medicines aren't meant to be profitable. But when is it okay to make money off sweetgrass? Tamara Pimentel visited an Indigenous-owned store to find out.
Amy Willier and her mother Yvonne Jobin run Moonstone Creations, a gift shop where Calgarians can find things like Indigenous art and clothing, along with sage sweetgrass and smudge kits. A photo of this sweetgrass found in the home decor section of Winners made its way around social media. Some say it isn't something to be bought. But Willier from Sucker Creek First Nation says times have changed.
I can see people being upset because of the lack of protocol and having an expectation when you're picking medicines and using medicines. I can understand where they're coming from, but from a store perspective, I also can understand that, yeah, you kind of need to make money.
At Moonstone Creations, the sweetgrass is picked by an elder from Saskatchewan. She is then given tobacco and money.
Traditionally, we gave gifts, and so the exchange rate now is money, because it costs gas to go and pick, and it costs you your food that you're going to give, and that all costs money because that's the world that we live in.
A world where many urban Indigenous have lost their culture. Willier says not many people know how or where to pick sweetgrass, and sometimes they just don't have access to it.
Well, people come and buy sweetgrass for gifts for elders, for people that are in jail right now. They come and get it from us, and then they're able to smudge while they're in jail, which is a beautiful thing. I think that's okay, because where else could they get it?
People who buy medicines from Moonstone Creations are given instructions on how to smudge to help keep Indigenous traditions alive. So is it okay for things like sweetgrass and smudge kits to be made profitable?
Well, I guess the main question here in the middle of winter, in January, the question is, are you going to smudge or not smudge? And if you want to smudge, you're going to find a source.
To Willier, it's about intention. She says she believes if the source is unknown, offerings to Mother Earth can be made. Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Calgary.
Time for another quick break, but stick around. We're chatting with reporter Charlotte Mort-Jacobs on her latest story for APTN Investigates called North of Hope, airing this Friday. Here's the rest of Friday's weather forecast, picking back up in northern Alberta. 12 below in High River, -7 in Grand Prairie, -4 in Edmonton, Medicine Hat, and Lethbridge. Sunny skies in the west coast, +4 in Vancouver, +2 in Bella Coola, -7 in Prince George, -10 in Fort Nelson. Chilly day in Yukon, -27 in Dawson City, -28 in Old Crow. Over to NWT, sunny and 12 below in Trout Lake, -22 in Yellowknife, -19 in Fort McPherson, -27 in Sax Harbor. In Nunavut, a frosty -33 in Whale Cove and Baker Lake. An even colder day in Iqaluit, sun and -36, -33 in Clyde River. Tomorrow on APTN Investigates, a look at mental health services in the north. Charlotte Morg-Jacobs joins us now from our Yellowknife Bureau. Thanks for joining us, Charlotte. How did the story come on your radar?
Yes, well, back in spring of 2017, there was a string of suicides in the Decho region of the Northwest Territories. Now, 4 of them took place in Fort Simpson, traditionally known as Lillikwe, and it seemed to be that every month there was another suicide. And at the time, there was only one counselor working in the Decho region. Now, I traveled down to Fort Simpson after the death of a youth that sparked a lot of community outrage and really desperation. When I attended a suicide intervention meeting, I heard a lot of stories from youth about a lack of mental health resources and really nowhere to turn. So with that, I decided to research further.
So what's changed with bullying when it comes to Indigenous youth?
Now, with bullying, it's something that's always been around. It's a saying of kids will be kids. But realistically, something that's changed nowadays is the prevalence of cyberbullying. And I heard it in Fort Simpson that there's really nowhere to turn when you go home, and harassment and bullying can really follow you into the home, and your parents virtually have no idea that it's happening. I think that's something that we don't have maybe enough understanding of, and laws have kind of lagged in catching up with that. And that's something that really came about that I learned.
How does the North look at youth suicides, and after your research, what do you think is the best way for them to address it?
Yes, well, right now in the North, we look at things at an individual approach. Now, when I mentioned earlier that there was only one counselor working, that counselor happened to be from the South. We bring up a lot of folks that interact with kids quite a bit, like teachers and counselors. However, we train them, and their capacities leave when they leave as well. When we look at things at an individual approach, research shows that it's very hard to dictate who is going to commit suicide and who's not. And through this piece, I learned that really we need to be taking a community-based approach. When this crisis happened, I really wondered why is this community being plagued while others are going untouched. Now, there's cultural markers as well that go along with that. In the piece, it'll show that communities that have their own police force, that have their own nursing station, education system, land claims, they're more likely to be untouched by suicide. So we need to start looking at things from a community-based approach and tackle those issues first instead of looking at the individual.
Okay, thanks, Charlotte. North of Hope, that'll be airing tomorrow on APTN Investigates. That's your APTN National News for this Thursday. Stay tuned for Nation to Nation.